morning of March 18th, 1943, broke humid and gray over the Huon Peninsula in Papua New Guinea. Private First Class Raymond Dalton stood knee-deep in mud outside the quartermaster tent, sorting through unwashed fatigues that reeked of mildew and sweat. He was 22, a farm kid from Iowa who had enlisted dreaming of combat and glory, only to find himself managing inventory for the 32nd Infantry Division. Around him, men carried ammunition crates and field radios, preparing for the next push into Japanese-held territory. Dalton watched with quiet envy, knowing that while they would write home about firefights and advances, he would be counting boots and recording serial numbers in ledgers no one would ever read. The war had become an endless cycle of requisition forms and supply counts, a bureaucratic purgatory where his closest brush with danger was a paper cut. But on this particular morning, as he pinned a sergeant's trousers to a rope between two trees, Raymond Dalton had no idea his mundane assignment was about to intersect with one of the most unconventional tactical operations in the Pacific Campaign. The camp sat in a narrow valley surrounded by dense jungle-climbing steep ridges on all sides. For weeks, Allied reconnaissance had reported sporadic Japanese activity in the northern highlands, but pinpointing enemy positions had proven nearly impossible. The jungle canopy was too thick for effective aerial observation, and ground patrols sent into ravines often returned empty-handed or didn't return at all. The Japanese had mastered concealment in this terrain, building fortifications that blended seamlessly into the landscape, camouflaging supply depots under vegetation, and moving through the forest with unnerving silence. Command knew the enemy was out there, somewhere in those green labyrinths, but without precise coordinates, any bombing run would be expensive guesswork. Intelligence estimates suggested a full company, perhaps more, was operating in caves and bunkers somewhere in the ridges overlooking Allied supply routes. If that force struck at the right moment, it could cut off an entire division and turn the campaign into disaster. Raymond Dalton was not a strategist. Back in Cedar Rapids, he had worked in his father's dry goods store, learning the careful arithmetic of inventory management and the importance of organization. He could glance at a shelf and instantly know if something was missing or out of place. His mind worked in patterns and systems, finding order in chaos, and that skill had made him invaluable to Quartermaster Corps, even if it hadn't earned him respect. The other men called him the Laundryman or Dalton the Dull, nicknames that stung more than he let on. He accepted the teasing with quiet nods, folding shirts and counting socks, while real soldiers told stories of ambushes and near misses. But underneath that placid exterior, Raymond Dalton carried his own frustration, a simmering need to prove he was more than just a clerk, that he could contribute something meaningful beyond clean underwear. He read field manuals in his spare time, studied maps, listened carefully when officers discussed tactics. He wasn't educated in warfare, but he was observant, and observation, he believed, was its own form of intelligence. On March 15th, 3 days before the operation that would make him infamous, Dalton was organizing supplies near the airstrip when he overheard two pilots complaining about impossible mission orders. One, a lieutenant with sunburned nose and Texas drawl, kept jabbing his finger at a creased map. "They want us to hit a Japanese camp somewhere in this sector." Somewhere. Like we're supposed to just fly around until we spot guys waving a flag that says "bomb here." The jungle's too damn thick. We could be 50 feet above them and never know it. The other pilot nodded. And if we drop ordnance blind, we're just as likely to hit our own patrols. Command wants results but won't give us targets we can actually see. Dalton listened from behind crates, his mind working through the problem like a logistics puzzle. The issue wasn't a lack of bombs or pilots or courage. It was communication, translating information from ground to air in a way that was clear and unambiguous. The pilots couldn't see the target, and ground troops couldn't effectively point it out. What they needed was a signal, something visible from the air but innocuous enough that the Japanese wouldn't recognize it as a marker. An idea began to form, fragile and strange, and Dalton turned it over in his mind for 2 days, testing its logic, looking for flaws. By March 17th, Raymond Dalton had convinced himself his idea might actually work. The challenge was convincing anyone else. He knew that proposing tactical innovation would be met with skepticism at best, outright ridicule at worst. He was a supply clerk, not an officer, not a combat veteran, not anyone whose opinion on military strategy carried weight. But he also knew the reconnaissance problem was becoming critical, that lives were being lost because Allied forces were fighting blind, and that doing nothing was its own form of failure. That evening, as the camp settled into card games and quiet conversations, Dalton approached Captain Michael Brennan, the battalion's intelligence officer. Brennan was a career soldier, 15 years in the Army, a man who had seen action in North Africa. He had a reputation for being fair but no nonsense, someone who valued results over protocol. Dalton found him writing a letter by kerosene lamp. Brennan looked up. "Something I can do for you, Private?" Dalton steadied his nerves. "Sir, I have an idea about the reconnaissance problem, about marking targets for air strikes." Brennan set down his pen. "I'm listening." Dalton explained carefully, trying to sound confident without arrogance. The idea was simple in theory, but required precise execution. He proposed using laundry, ordinary shirts, trousers, and undergarments, strung on lines in specific patterns visible from the air. Each color and arrangement would correspond to a coded message, indicating location and type of enemy position. A white shirt next to brown trousers might mean enemy fortification, 200 yards north. A red undershirt at the line's end could signal artillery position. The system would be visible to pilots, but look completely innocuous to Japanese observers, just soldiers doing their washing. The beauty was its simplicity. It required no special equipment, no radio transmissions that could be intercepted, no complex technology that could fail. It was low-tech, improvised, and utterly unexpected. Brennan listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When Dalton finished, there was long silence. Then Brennan rubbed his jaw and exhaled slowly. "That's either brilliant or insane. Possibly both." He stood, pacing. "Even if it works, we need a ground team willing to go deep into enemy territory, to set it up, and a pilot who can read the signals and act without hesitation. Coordination would have to be perfect." Dalton nodded. "Yes, sir, but the alternative is more blind bombing runs that accomplish nothing." Brennan studied him for a long moment, then made his decision. "I'll take it to the colonel. No promises. But if he approves this, you're going out with the recon team. This is your idea, Private. You don't get to hide behind a desk while someone else takes the risk." Colonel Frank Hastings was not easily impressed. When Captain Brennan presented Raymond Dalton's proposal on March 17th, Hastings' first reaction was a raised eyebrow and skeptical grunt. The colonel was stocky with graying hair and a face weathered by 2 decades of military service. He had fought in France during the Great War and believed in discipline, proven tactics, hard lessons learned through blood and sacrifice. Improvisation, in his view, was usually just polite desperation. "Laundry," he said flatly, staring at Brennan as if the captain had suggested attacking with water balloons. "You want me to authorize a reconnaissance mission based on hanging laundry?" Brennan stood his ground. "With respect, sir, it's not as absurd as it sounds. The principle is sound. We need a way to mark targets visible from the air, but doesn't alert the enemy. This accomplishes both. It's camouflaged in plain sight." Hastings leaned back, fingers drumming his desk. Outside, the camp continued its sounds, men shouting orders, engines coughing to life, distant artillery thumps. The colonel was silent for a long time, working through logistics, risks, potential disaster. Finally, he spoke. "If this fails, if we lose men because some clerk thought he was being clever, that's on you, Captain. And on him." He jabbed a finger toward Dalton, who had been standing at attention, barely breathing. "But if it works, if we can finally get a clean shot at that Japanese company, it might turn this whole sector around." He paused and nodded decisively. "You have authorization for one mission. One, pick your team carefully. And Brennan, make sure Private Dalton understands that if he's coming along, he's not there to take notes. He's there to survive." The team assembled before dawn on March 18th. 6 men. Captain Brennan would lead, accompanied by 2 experienced scouts, Corporal James Novak and Private Eddie Suarez, both veterans of the treacherous jungle terrain. A combat engineer, Sergeant Lewis Hammond, was included to assess fortifications. Radio operator Private First Class Anthony Rizzo carried the bulky field radio, their only link to base. And then Raymond Dalton, the supply clerk who had talked his way into one of the most dangerous missions of the campaign. He carried a rucksack filled with carefully selected clothing, white shirts, brown trousers, a red undershirt, blue work pants. To anyone watching, it looked random, but Dalton had memorized the code, knew exactly what each combination meant, and had spent the previous night rehearsing until he could set it up in under 10 minutes. The team moved out as first gray light touched the eastern sky, slipping into the jungle single file, footsteps muffled by thick undergrowth. The air was already heavy with humidity, and within minutes, Dalton's uniform was soaked with sweat. He had never been on combat patrol, and every sound seemed amplified, every rustling leaf potential threat. Novak and Suarez moved with practiced ease, eyes constantly scanning, rifles ready. Brennan set a steady pace, leading them north toward the ridgeline where intelligence believed the Japanese had established their forward position. For 2 hours, the journey was grueling but uneventful. The jungle was a maze of tangled vines, thorny bushes, and slippery mud. They crossed 2 shallow streams, wading through thigh-high water, and climbed a steep hillside where every step threatened to send them sliding back. Dalton struggled to keep up, legs burning, lungs aching, but he refused to slow the group. He had asked for this, insisted his idea was worth the risk, and he would not be the weak link compromising the mission. Around mid-morning, Novak raised a fist, signaling halt. The team froze, dropping into cover. Dalton crouched low, heart hammering, watching as the corporal moved forward examining something on the ground. After a tense minute, Novak waved them forward. "Trail," he whispered, pointing to a narrow path cutting through underbrush. The dirt was packed down with fresh boot prints, the distinctive pattern of Japanese Army-issue footwear. They've been using this route regularly. "We're close." Brennan nodded grimly. "We move parallel to the trail, but stay off it. No direct contact unless absolutely necessary. We're here to observe and mark, not fight." The team adjusted course, staying in denser cover east of the trail. The tension ratcheted up with every step. They were deep in enemy territory now, and the margin for error had shrunk to nothing. Another hour passed before Suarez spotted the ravine. It cut through the landscape like a scar, a deep cleft perhaps 50 yards wide and twice as long. The sides were steep, nearly vertical in places, covered with scrub and loose rock. And at the bottom, partially concealed by overhanging vegetation, was clear evidence of Japanese occupation. Dalton could see dark cave mouths carved into the ravine wall, fortified with logs and sandbags. Supply crates were stacked near one entrance, and thin smoke rose from what was likely a cooking fire. As the team watched from their concealed ridge position, Japanese soldiers moved in and out of the caves, perhaps a dozen visible, though undoubtedly more inside. This was it, the forward position that had eluded Allied reconnaissance for weeks. But spotting it from the ground was one thing. Directing an air strike to this exact location was another matter. The jungle canopy was dense, and from above, the ravine would be almost impossible to distinguish from dozens of similar features in the area. That's where Dalton's system would come into play. Brennan turned to him, voice barely a whisper. "Can you set up the markers from here?" Dalton studied the terrain, mind calculating angles and visibility. "There's a clearing about 200 yards west," he said, pointing to a break in the canopy where a rock slide had created open space. "If I string the line there, it'll be visible from the air, and pilots can use it to orient themselves to the ravine. The color code will tell them exact distance and direction." Brennan considered, then nodded. "Hammond, Suarez, you go with him. Set up fast and quiet. Novak, Rizzo, and I will maintain overwatch. If anything goes wrong, we rally at Checkpoint Delta." The checkpoint was a stream junction they had passed an hour earlier, a fallback position if the mission went sideways. Dalton, Hammond, and Suarez moved carefully through underbrush, angling toward the clearing. Every step was deliberate, every sound a potential giveaway. Dalton's hand shook slightly, adrenaline and fear mixing equally, but his mind remained focused. He had run through this procedure 100 times mentally, and now it was time to execute. They reached the clearing edge, and Dalton quickly assessed the space. 2 sturdy trees stood about 30 feet apart, perfect anchor points for the laundry line. He pulled rope from his rucksack and handed one end to Hammond. "String it tight between those trees. Waist height." While Hammond secured the rope, Dalton began pulling out clothing items, arranging them in predetermined sequence. A white shirt first, positioned at the western end. Then brown trousers, followed by a red undershirt. Each piece was carefully clipped to the rope with wooden clothespins. Spacing precise. The white shirt indicated the starting reference point. The brown trousers, positioned 3 feet east, signaled enemy position at 200 yards, bearing 045 degrees. The red undershirt, another 2 feet down, meant fortified position, multiple targets. Finally, blue work pan to the eastern end indicated request immediate strike. To anyone observing from the ground, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to be. Soldiers doing laundry, but from the air, for a pilot briefed on the system, it was a precise targeting solution, a visual map that would guide bombs directly to the hidden ravine. The setup took less than 8 minutes. Dalton stepped back, checking the arrangement one final time. Hammond stood guard, rifle pointed toward the ravine, while Suarez crouched low, scanning the jungle. Dalton wiped sweat from his forehead and gave Hammond a curt nod. "It's done. Let's get back to the captain." The 3 men retraced their steps and within 15 minutes rejoined Brennan, Novak, and Rizzo at the overwatch position. Brennan examined the clearing through field binoculars, studying the laundry line from elevated vantage. From this angle, the arrangement was clearly visible, white and colored fabrics standing out against the green jungle backdrop. He lowered the binoculars and turned to Rizzo. "Get on the radio. Tell command the markers are in place and provide coordinates. Inform them we need an air strike within 2 hours before the enemy shift position or weather turns." Rizzo nodded, already pulling the heavy radio from his pack. He extended the antenna, adjusted the frequency, and began transmitting in low, clipped phrases. "Ironclad 6. This is Recon Delta. Package is delivered. Markers are live at coordinate 784-321. Request immediate air support. Repeat, immediate air support." Static crackled. Then a voice came through, faint but clear. "Recon Delta. This is Ironclad 6. Confirm coordinate 784-321. Air support is being tasked. Estimated time on target, 90 minutes. Acknowledge." Rizzo glanced at Brennan, who nodded. "Recon Delta acknowledges. 90 minutes. We will maintain position and provide ground confirmation. Over." The radio fell silent, and the team settled in to wait. 90 minutes might as well have been 90 hours in enemy territory. Every second stretched out, every sound magnified, every shadow a potential threat. The Japanese camp below continued its routine, soldiers moving between caves. Unaware they had been marked for destruction, the minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Dalton found himself counting seconds, then losing track, then starting over. He watched Japanese soldiers below, going about their business with no idea that death was racing toward them from the sky. At the 70-minute mark, Novak stiffened, head cocked. Engine noise, coming from the south. Everyone froze, listening. At first, Dalton heard nothing but jungle sounds, buzzing insects, a distant bird call. Then, faintly, he detected it. The low, steady drone of an aircraft engine. The sound grew louder, and within moments, they could see it, a single P-40 Warhawk, flying low and fast from the south. The pilot, Lieutenant Derek Halloway, had been briefed on the mission less than an hour earlier. He had listened with barely concealed skepticism as the intelligence officer explained the laundry line system. Certain someone was pulling his leg, but the officer's expression had been deadly serious, and the coordinates were solid. So Halloway had loaded his Warhawk with high-explosive ordnance and taken off, determined to give the unconventional plan a fair chance. Now, as he approached the target area, he scanned the jungle below, looking for the signal. The canopy was dense, an endless carpet of green, and for a heart-stopping moment, he thought he had missed it. Then, just off his right wing, he saw it, a clearing with ropes stretched between 2 trees, and hanging from that rope a row of brightly colored clothing. White, brown, red, blue. He banked slightly, dropping altitude, and mentally reviewed the code. White for reference point, brown and red for position and fortification, blue for strike authorization. The geometry lined up perfectly. He adjusted his heading, using the laundry line as visual guide, and calculated the bearing. 200 yards northeast from the clearing. Holloway focused, hand steady on controls. He had flown dozens of bombing runs in the Pacific, but none quite like this. He came in low over the clearing, the laundry line flashing beneath his wings. Then he was past it, racing toward the coordinates. The ravine appeared suddenly, a dark gash in the jungle, and Holloway's trained eye immediately picked out telltale signs of enemy occupation. Fortified cave entrances, stacked supplies, faint trails cutting through underbrush. He armed his bombs, thumb hovering over the release switch, and at the precise moment he pressed it. The aircraft shuddered slightly as ordnance dropped away, for 500-pound bombs tumbling to the air in a lethal arc. Holloway pulled up sharply, banking east, not waiting to observe impact. The explosions came seconds later, a series of concussive blasts echoing across the valley. From his cockpit, Holloway saw plumes of smoke and debris rising from the ravine, and he allowed himself a tight smile. The laundry line had worked. He keyed his radio. Ironclad 6. This is Hawk 1. Ordnance delivered on target. Multiple impacts confirmed. Returning to base. On the ridge overlooking the ravine, the reconnaissance team watched in stunned silence as the bomb struck home. The first explosion collapsed the entrance to the largest cave, burying whatever was inside under tons of rock and earth. The second and third bombs impacted along the ravine floor, sending shrapnel and debris flying. The fourth bomb struck the far side, triggering a secondary explosion that suggested they had hit a munitions cache. The blasts were deafening, even from their elevated position, and the ground shook with the force. Dust and smoke billowed into the air, obscuring the ravine. When the echoes faded and smoke began clearing, the devastation was total. Cave entrances had been sealed, supply stacks obliterated, and the narrow paths crisscrossing the ravine floor were now cratered and impassable. If there had been survivors, they were trapped deep inside collapsed tunnels with no clear means of escape. Brennan lowered the binoculars, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and grim acknowledgement. Well, I'll be damned. It worked. Dalton felt a surge of emotion, relief, pride, and horror all tangled together. His idea, his improvised signal, had just guided a devastating strike that had likely killed dozens of enemy soldiers. He had contributed to the war effort in a way that mattered, but the weight of that contribution settled on him like a physical burden. The team remained in position for another 30 minutes, observing the aftermath and ensuring no Japanese reinforcements were moving toward the site. The ravine was eerily silent now. Usual sounds of activity replaced by the low crackle of small fires and occasional rumble of shifting debris. No one emerged from sealed caves, and no patrols appeared on surrounding trails. The strike had been so sudden and complete that the enemy had been given no time to react or retreat. Captain Brennan finally signaled withdrawal, and the 6 men began the long trek back to base, moving carefully through the jungle, retracing their morning route. The adrenaline that had sustained them during the mission was wearing off, replaced by exhaustion and bone-deep weariness that comes after intense stress. By late afternoon, they emerged from the tree line and saw the familiar outline of the Allied camp spread out in the valley below. Word of the successful strike had already reached the camp, and as the reconnaissance team made their way through the perimeter, they were met with curious stares and a few cautious nods of approval. Dalton, still carrying his now empty rucksack, felt strangely disconnected from the reality around him. He had expected to feel triumphant, perhaps even heroic, but instead felt hollow, drained of emotion. Captain Brennan led the team directly to the command tent, where Colonel Hastings was waiting. The colonel listened intently as Brennan delivered his after-action report, describing successful placement of markers, coordination with the pilot, and devastating effectiveness of the air strike. Hastings asked a few pointed questions, eyes sharp and calculating, then nodded in satisfaction. "Good work, Captain. And you, Private Dalton." The colonel's gaze shifted to the supply clerk, who stood at attention, trying not to sway with fatigue. Your unorthodox thinking paid off. I'll be recommending you for a commendation. The real impact of the laundry line operation became apparent over following days. Intelligence reports confirmed the airstrike had not just destroyed a forward position, but had effectively neutralized an entire Japanese company. Post-strike reconnaissance revealed 32 enemy bodies recovered from collapsed caves, with estimates suggesting additional casualties remained buried. The company had been preparing for a coordinated assault on Allied supply lines, an attack that could have disrupted operations across the entire sector. By eliminating that threat, the laundry line mission had potentially saved dozens, perhaps hundreds of Allied lives. The success attracted attention, though not all positive. Some officers dismissed the operation as a fluke, a lucky gamble that should not be repeated or formalized into doctrine. They argued that relying on improvised signals was too risky, too dependent on uncontrollable variables. But there were others, younger officers mostly, who saw the operation as a model for adaptive thinking, a demonstration that unconventional problems required unconventional solutions. Lieutenant Derek Halloway became an unexpected advocate for the laundry line system. During his debrief, he emphasized how clear and effective the visual markers had been, how they had allowed him to strike with precision impossible with standard targeting methods. He recommended similar techniques be tested in other operations, with refinements suited to different terrain and tactical situations. His endorsement carried weight because he was an experienced pilot with a proven combat record. Within a week, word of the operation had spread beyond the 32nd Infantry Division. Other units began experimenting with their own versions of the concept, using everything from colored tarps to arrange rocks to signal aircraft. Not all experiments were successful, and there were a few embarrassing failures, but the underlying principle held. Visual markers, when used intelligently and in coordination with air support, could bridge the gap between ground reconnaissance and aerial strikes. For Raymond Dalton, the aftermath was bittersweet. He received his commendation, a brief ceremony in which Colonel Hastings pinned a medal to his uniform and shook his hand. There was polite applause from assembled officers and a few genuine words of congratulation, but Dalton could also sense underlying skepticism, the unspoken message that he had gotten lucky and should not expect to be treated as anything more than what he was, a supply clerk who had stumbled into a moment of relevance. The nickname Laundryman persisted, though now it carried a different connotation, less mocking and more ironic. He was still assigned to the Quartermaster Corps, still counting boots and sorting supplies, and the daily routine remained unchanged. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer felt the same frustration or sense of inadequacy. He had proven, if only to himself, that observation and careful thinking could be as valuable as physical courage, that there were many ways to contribute to the war effort, and that heroism was not always loud or obvious. Captain Michael Brennan made sure Dalton's role in the operation was fully documented in official reports. He understood that supply clerks did not usually receive recognition for tactical innovations, and he wanted to ensure Dalton's contribution was not lost or forgotten in the bureaucratic shuffle. In his written account, Brennan emphasized that the mission's success had been a result of collaboration, of listening to unconventional ideas, and being willing to take calculated risks. He noted that the Army would benefit from fostering a culture where soldiers at all levels felt empowered to offer suggestions and solutions rather than simply following orders without question. It was a subtle critique of the rigid hierarchy that often stifled innovation, and it resonated with some of the more progressive officers who read it. The Japanese forces in the region were left confused and demoralized by the sudden destruction of their forward company. They had believed their position to be well concealed, protected by dense jungle and natural fortifications of the ravine. The precision of the Allied strike suggested a level of intelligence and coordination they had not anticipated. In the weeks following the attack, Japanese commanders became more cautious, more defensive, pulling back from exposed positions and fortifying remaining strongholds. This shift in strategy gave the Allied forces an opening, a chance to advance and reclaim territory that had been contested for months. The laundry line operation had not won the war, not even close, but had tilted the balance in a critical sector, and that was often how wars were won, through small, incremental advantages that accumulated over time. Raymond Dalton understood this better than most. He knew his contribution, significant as it was, represented just one thread in a vast and complex tapestry. But he also knew that every thread mattered, that every act of ingenuity and courage, no matter how small, brought the end of the conflict one step closer. In the month that followed, the Pacific Theater continued its grinding, brutal advance. The Allies pushed forward, island by island, ridge by ridge, each victory measured in yards gained and lives lost. Raymond Dalton remained with the 32nd Infantry Division, his days still filled with mundane tasks of supply management, but he carried himself differently now. The other men, even those who had once mocked him, treated him with respect. He was still the laundry man, but the title had evolved into something almost affectionate, a recognition that beneath the ordinary exterior was a mind capable of extraordinary thinking. He never sought the spotlight, never boasted about his role, and that humility only enhanced his reputation. The laundry line technique itself saw a limited but notable use in subsequent operations. It was never formalized into official doctrine, in part because its effectiveness depended on specific conditions: clear sight lines in the air, cooperative weather, and an enemy that did not recognize the signals. But in situations where those conditions were met, the method proved valuable. There were reports of similar operations in Burma and the Philippines, variations on Dalton's original concept adapted to local terrain and tactical needs. Some used colored smoke canisters instead of clothing. Others employed arranged panels or mirrors to reflect sunlight. The underlying principle remained the same: find a way to communicate precise information from ground to air using simple, improvised means. It was low-tech ingenuity in an increasingly high-tech war, a reminder that even in an age of advanced weaponry and mechanized warfare, human creativity and resourcefulness remained irreplaceable assets. Raymond Dalton returned home to Cedar Rapids in autumn 1945, after the war in the Pacific had finally ended. He stepped off the train into a world that seemed both familiar and foreign, a place where the war was already becoming history, receding into memory and myth. He went back to work in his father's dry goods store, folding shirts and managing inventory, the same tasks he had performed before the war. Customers came and went, buying fabric and thread and buttons, and none of them knew that the quiet man behind the counter had once guided a bombing run that had killed 32 enemy soldiers and prevented a major assault on Allied lines. Dalton did not tell them, did not speak of his experiences, except in the vaguest terms. He attended a few veteran gatherings, sat through speeches and parades, but he always felt out of place at those events, surrounded by men who wore their service like a badge and seemed eager to relive the war through endless retellings. For Dalton, the war was something to be remembered privately, a chapter of his life that had shaped him but did not define him. He married in 1947, had 2 children, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He died in 1983, at the age of 62, of a heart attack while working in his garden. His obituary mentioned he had served in the Pacific during World War II, but said nothing about laundry lines or bombing runs or unconventional tactics. To his family and neighbors, he was simply Raymond Dalton, a decent man who had done his duty and come home. But the legacy of what he accomplished lived on, not in grand monuments or official histories, but in the small, persistent ways that ideas propagate through military culture. Officers who had heard about the laundry line operation passed the story along to their subordinates, who in turn passed it to theirs, and with each retelling, the lesson was reinforced. That innovation often comes from unexpected places, that rigid adherence to doctrine can be a liability, and that the willingness to try something new, even something that seems absurd, can sometimes mean the difference between victory and defeat. The story became part of the informal oral tradition of the military, a tale told in training courses and late-night conversations, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes distorted, but always carrying that core truth. And in that way, Raymond Dalton's contribution endured, not as a name in a history book, but as a principle embedded in the collective consciousness of generations of soldiers who came after him. A reminder that heroism wears many faces and that the ordinary can, in the right moment, become extraordinary.